The blizzard had been raging for 3 days across the frozen wasteland of Kepler 442b, and Marcus Chen was beginning to wonder if his mining station would hold against the howling winds. The prefab shelter groaned and creaked as ice crystals pelted its reinforced walls like tiny bullets. He'd seen storms before during his 2 years on this remote planet, but nothing quite like this. Marcus stood at the observation window, watching the swirling white chaos outside, when something caught his eye. A dark shape moved against the snow, too large to be debris, too deliberate to be random. He squinted through the frost-covered glass, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The shape moved again, and this time he was certain. Something was out there in the killing cold. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his thermal suit from the emergency locker. The suit was designed to keep a human alive in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in seconds, but even with its protection, he knew he had minutes at most before the cold became deadly. He sealed the helmet and checked the heating elements one final time before stepping into the airlock. The moment the outer door opened, the full fury of the blizzard hit him like a physical blow. Wind speeds had to be pushing 60 kilometers per hour, and the temperature gauge on his suit display read minus 43 degrees Celsius. Marcus pushed forward into the storm, following the direction where he'd seen the movement. His boots crunched through knee-deep snowdrifts, each step a struggle against the wind that seemed determined to push him back to safety. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, he found them. 2 small forms lay huddled together in a shallow depression that offered minimal protection from the wind. At first glance, they looked like large lizards, but as Marcus knelt beside them, he realized he was looking at something far more extraordinary. Baby dragons. Real, living dragons, each no bigger than a house cat, with scales that shimmered a deep emerald green even in the dim stormlight. Their eyes were closed, and frost had begun to form on their delicate wings. They were dying. Marcus didn't hesitate. He scooped both creatures into his arms, feeling how cold their small bodies had become through his insulated gloves. They were barely breathing, their tiny chests rising and falling in shallow, irregular patterns. The trek back to the shelter was a nightmare. The wind had shifted, making it harder to navigate, and the added weight of the dragons made each step more difficult. Marcus's suit heaters were working overtime, but he could feel the cold seeping in around the joints. His oxygen supply was dropping faster than normal as his breathing became labored, but he didn't stop. Something about these creatures, these impossible baby dragons abandoned in a deadly storm, touched something deep in his human heart. They needed help, and he was the only one who could provide it. By the time he reached the shelter, warning lights were flashing on his suit display. Core temperature dropping, oxygen at 15%, heating elements straining at maximum output. He practically fell through the airlock, gasping as the inner door sealed behind him. Marcus carried the dragons to the main living area and gently placed them on the heated floor near the thermal regulator. Up close, he could see just how beautiful and fragile they were. Their scales caught the light like tiny emeralds, and their wings, though small, showed the delicate bone structure that would one day carry them through the skies. He cranked up the shelter's heating system and grabbed every thermal blanket he could find, wrapping the small dragons carefully. One of them, slightly smaller than the other, opened its eyes as he worked. The dragon's gaze was intelligent, almost knowing, and Marcus felt a connection form in that moment that would change his life forever. The dragon's body temperatures were dangerously low. Marcus had basic medical training for human emergencies, but these weren't humans. Still, the principles of treating hypothermia had to be similar across species. Gradual warming, protection from further heat loss, and constant monitoring. He set up a makeshift incubator using heating pads and thermal blankets, creating a warm microenvironment around the dragons. Then he tried to figure out what they might need for food. His emergency rations included protein bars and nutrient paste, but he doubted baby dragons would find those appetizing or nutritious. As he worked, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about how the dragons had ended up out in the storm. This planet was supposed to be uninhabited except for the mining operation. The company surveys had found no signs of intelligent life, no ecosystems that could support large predators or, apparently, dragons. So where had they come from? The answer came sooner than he expected. As the smaller dragon began to show signs of recovery, lifting its head and making soft chirping sounds, Marcus's communication array lit up with an incoming transmission. But this wasn't from Earth or the mining company headquarters. The voice that came through the speakers was distinctly non-human, with clicking consonants and a melodic quality that no human throat could produce. Universal translators were standard equipment on frontier worlds, and within moments, the alien words were converted into English. Human Mining Unit, this is Flight Commander Zethkar of the Veltar Expedition. We are conducting a biological disposal operation in your sector. Do not interfere with our cleanup protocols. Marcus stared at the communication console. Then down at the two small dragons who were beginning to move more actively in their warm sanctuary. Biological disposal. The aliens had dumped these babies to die in the storm. This is Marcus Chen of Chen Mining Station 7, he responded, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. I'm not sure what your disposal operation involves, but if you're talking about the two young creatures I found dying in the blizzard, they're under my protection now. There was a long pause, filled only with the crackling of the communication system and the soft sounds the dragons were making as they explored their blanket nest. Human, the specimens you have retrieved are defective genetics from our breeding program. They possess unacceptable traits and must be eliminated. Return them to the storm immediately, or we will collect them by force. Marcus looked down at the dragons again. The larger one had managed to sit up and was looking at him with eyes that held an unmistakable intelligence. The smaller one had discovered how to spread its tiny wings and was attempting what might have been its first flight, managing to hover a few centimeters off the ground before settling back down. Defective genetics. Unacceptable traits. I don't think so, Marcus said into the microphone. These aren't specimens or defective anything. They're living beings, and they're staying right here where it's warm and safe. The alien's response was immediate and cold. You do not understand the situation, human. These creatures are the offspring of our war beasts. They show signs of empathy and compassion, traits that make them unsuitable for our military purposes. Such weaknesses cannot be allowed to contaminate our breeding lines. Marcus felt his blood run cold, but not from the temperature outside. These aliens were breeding dragons as weapons of war, and they considered empathy and compassion to be defects worth killing for. Their empathy isn't a defect, Marcus said, his voice growing harder. It's what makes them better than your war beasts, and it's what makes them worth saving. You are one human against a fully armed expedition fleet, came the alien's reply. You cannot protect them. Surrender the specimens now, and we will not harm you for interfering. Marcus looked out the window at the continuing blizzard, then back at the two dragons who were now playfully wrestling with each other in their nest of blankets. The larger one paused in its play to chirp at him, a sound that somehow conveyed gratitude and trust. He'd spent 2 years alone on this frozen rock, mining rare metals for a company that barely remembered his name. He'd accepted the isolation, the danger, the bone-deep cold that seemed to seep into everything, but he'd never expected to find something worth fighting for. Let me explain something to you, Commander, Marcus said, settling into the chair in front of his communication console. I'm a human being, and we have this particular trait that you might not understand. When we find someone helpless who needs protection, we don't calculate odds or consider superior firepower, we just protect them. The alien's voice carried what might have been confusion. "This is illogical. The specimens have no value to your species." Marcus smiled, watching as the smaller dragon figured out how to breathe a tiny puff of flame, no bigger than a candle's light, and seemed delighted with its own accomplishment. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "These little ones have exactly the kind of value that makes us human, and if you want them, you're going to have to come through me to get them." The communication channel went silent, leaving Marcus alone with the storm, his determination, and two baby dragons who were beginning to trust that they were finally, truly safe. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the small mining shelter, something wonderful was beginning to bloom. The dragons had found their protector, and Marcus had found his purpose. Neither the cold nor the aliens would change that simple, powerful truth. The larger dragon managed its first real flight, circling the main room once before landing gracefully on Marcus's shoulder. Its small claws gripped gently, careful not to hurt him, and it nuzzled against his cheek with a soft rumble that might have been a purr. Marcus reached up to gently stroke the dragon's scales, marveling at their warmth and the trust the creature was showing. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't imagine, but tonight, in this moment, he had two small lives depending on him. And that was enough to make him feel like the richest man in the galaxy. The blizzard finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a crystal-clear sky and a landscape transformed into a glittering wonderland of ice and snow. Marcus stood at his observation window, watching the sunrise paint the frozen world in shades of gold and pink, while two small dragons perched on his shoulders like the most exotic pets in the universe. In the 3 days since their rescue, the dragons had recovered completely, and then some. They'd grown noticeably larger, their scales had developed a deeper, more vibrant green color, and their personalities had begun to shine through in ways that constantly amazed Marcus. The larger dragon, who Marcus had started calling Nova, showed a curious and adventurous nature. She was always the first to investigate new sounds or objects, and she'd quickly figured out how to operate the simple mechanisms around the shelter. She could turn lights on and off, open cabinet doors, and had even learned to activate the food dispenser when she was hungry. The smaller dragon, Spark, was more thoughtful and gentle. He seemed to understand emotions in a way that was almost supernatural, appearing at Marcus's side whenever the isolation and stress got to be too much, offering comfort with soft chirps and the warm weight of his small body. Both dragons had learned their names with startling speed, and they responded to simple commands in English. More impressive still, they seemed to be learning to communicate back. Their chirps and small roars were becoming more varied and complex, as if they were developing their own vocabulary to talk with their human friend. Marcus had rigged up a better feeding system after discovering that the dragons were omnivores with a preference for protein. His emergency rations weren't ideal, but he'd supplemented them with protein synthesis from the shelter's biological lab equipment. It wasn't gourmet dining, but it was nutritious, and the dragons seemed to appreciate the effort. The real breakthrough had come when Nova accidentally knocked over a container of water and immediately began making distressed sounds until Marcus cleaned it up. Then Spark had deliberately spilled his own water dish and looked expectantly at Marcus until he understood what they wanted. They were trying to help. These supposedly defective war beasts wanted to contribute to their little household. Now Nova helped sort the mineral samples from Marcus's mining work, her sharp eyes surprisingly good at identifying different ore types. Spark had appointed himself guardian of the communication console, chirping warnings whenever incoming transmissions arrived. They worked together to keep the shelter tidy, and they'd even figured out how to help with basic maintenance tasks. It was during one of these peaceful domestic moments, with Nova carefully organizing geological samples while Spark monitored the radio frequencies, that everything changed. The attack came without warning. One moment, Marcus was updating his mining logs, and the next, the entire shelter shook as something massive landed on the roof with a thunderous crash. Emergency lights began flashing, and the hull integrity warning system screamed its electronic alert. Both dragons immediately took flight, hovering protectively near Marcus as he rushed to the emergency console. The external cameras showed 3 aircraft had landed around his shelter, sleek and alien in design, their hulls gleaming like black metal in the morning sunlight. "Human Marcus Chen," came the now familiar voice of Commander Zethkar through the communication system. "Your time for cooperation has expired. Surrender the defective specimens immediately, or we will take them by force." Marcus looked up at Nova and Spark, who were both watching him with trust and intelligence that made his heart ache. These weren't specimens or defective weapons. They were his friends, his family, the brightest lights in a lonely universe. "I told you before," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice steady. "They're not going anywhere." The response was immediate. Something struck the shelter's main door with tremendous force, causing the metal to buckle inward. The dragons chittered in alarm, and Marcus could see genuine fear in their eyes for the first time since their rescue. "It's okay," he told them, though his mind was racing through possibilities. "We're going to get through this." Another impact hit the door, this one hard enough to crack the seal. Marcus realized he had perhaps minutes before the Veltar soldiers broke through. His mining shelter hadn't been designed to withstand military assault, and he had no weapons beyond the standard emergency equipment. But he did have something the aliens didn't expect: human ingenuity, born from desperation and love. Marcus rushed to his mining equipment storage and began pulling out everything that could be repurposed. Mining charges, meant for blasting through rock, could create quite an impressive defensive barrier if detonated at the right moment. The industrial welding unit could be modified to produce a much more destructive beam than its original design intended. Most importantly, he had the shelter's emergency protocols. "Nova, Spark," he called to the dragons as he worked frantically with the equipment. "I need you to fly to the back storage compartment and stay there until I call for you. There's a ventilation shaft that leads outside. If things go badly, I want you to escape through there." Both dragons chittered negative responses, clearly unwilling to leave him. "Please," Marcus said, pausing in his work to look at them directly. "I can't protect you if I'm worried about you getting hurt. Trust me." Nova and Spark exchanged what could only be described as a conversation in their dragon language, a series of soft chirps and small roars that seemed to carry complex meaning. Finally, reluctantly, they flew toward the back of the shelter. The main door finally gave way with a screech of torn metal, and 3 figures in sleek combat armor stepped through the breach. The Veltar soldiers were tall and thin, with elongated limbs that moved with an unsettling grace. Their faces were hidden behind helmets, but Marcus could see glowing red sensors where eyes might be. "Human," the lead soldier spoke through a translator device, its voice mechanically distorted. "Provide the location of the specimens, and your death will be swift." Marcus stood in the center of his ruined shelter, holding what looked like a standard mining tool, but was actually his hastily modified welding unit. "You know, that's not really the kind of offer that motivates cooperation." The soldier raised what was clearly an energy weapon. "You cannot resist. We are superior in every way." "Maybe," Marcus said, and triggered the first of his mining charges. The explosion wasn't meant to hurt the soldiers directly. Their armor looked sophisticated enough to handle much worse. Instead, it brought down part of the shelter's ceiling, creating a barrier between Marcus and 2 of the 3 intruders, while filling the air with dust and debris that would confuse their sensors. Marcus rolled behind his makeshift cover and activated his modified welding unit. Instead of the narrow beam designed for precise metalwork, it now produced a wide, devastating arc of energy that could cut through the soldier's armor at close range. The remaining soldier advanced cautiously through the dust cloud, weapon ready. Marcus waited until the alien was close enough, then triggered his improvised weapon. The energy beam caught the soldier's center mass, and Marcus was surprised to see that the alien's supposedly superior armor couldn't handle the modified output. The soldier went down hard, his weapon clattering across the floor. But Marcus's victory was short-lived. The explosion had cleared enough debris for the other two soldiers to advance, and they were no longer underestimating their human opponent. The firefight that followed was brief, but intense. Marcus used every advantage his knowledge of the shelter provided, triggering emergency systems to create smoke screens, using the mining equipment as mobile cover, and generally making the aliens' lives as difficult as possible. But he was still one human against trained soldiers with superior technology. It was only a matter of time before they cornered him. That was when Nova and Spark decided they'd had enough of hiding. Marcus first became aware of their intervention when one of the soldiers suddenly staggered backward, swatting at something small and green that was breathing fire directly onto his helmet's visual sensors. The soldier's weapon discharge went wild, striking the wall near the ceiling and bringing down another section of debris. Spark appeared a moment later, having somehow gotten behind the second soldier and was systematically destroying the alien's equipment with precisely targeted jets of flame. The soldier spun around, trying to target the small dragon, but Spark was too fast and too clever, staying just out of reach while continuing his sabotage. Nova had apparently decided that the direct approach worked best for her personality. She'd grown enough in the past few days that her fire breath was now genuinely dangerous, and she was using it to methodically melt the first soldier's weapon into useless slag. The aliens were clearly unprepared for this kind of resistance. Their training had prepared them to fight large, predictable war beasts, not small, intelligent dragons working in coordination with a resourceful human. Marcus took advantage of their confusion to activate the final part of his desperate plan. The shelter's emergency beacon, normally used to call for rescue, had been modified to broadcast on all frequencies with maximum power. But instead of a distress call, it was sending out every piece of data Marcus had collected about the Veltar operation, the alien breeding program, the abandonment of defective dragons in killing storms, the forced genetic modification to remove empathy and compassion. All of it was now being broadcast to every human ship and station within range. "What are you doing?" the lead soldier demanded, his voice distorted by the damage Nova had done to his helmet. "I'm telling my people what you are," Marcus said simply, "and what you've been doing to these dragons." The soldier raised a backup weapon, but Spark chose that moment to land on the alien's arm and bite down hard on the weapon's energy cell. The device sparked, overloaded, and exploded in a shower of harmless but spectacular light. All three soldiers were now effectively disarmed, their armor damaged, and facing a human who clearly wasn't going to surrender, and two dragons who fought with the kind of creative intelligence that no military training could prepare someone for. The lead soldier touched a device on his chest, and Marcus could hear him speaking in the Veltar language to his ship. "They're calling for backup," Marcus said to Nova and Spark, who had both returned to hovering near him. "We need to be ready for round 2. But the dragons weren't looking at him with fear anymore. Nova chirped something that sounded almost like laughter, while Spark began what Marcus could only describe as a victory dance in midair. That was when Marcus realized something important had changed. The dragons were no longer helpless babies who needed protection. They were partners, allies, friends who could stand beside him and face whatever came next. Outside, he could hear the alien ships powering up their engines, and Marcus knew Commander Zethkar would be back with more soldiers and better weapons. But he also knew something else. His emergency broadcast had been picked up. The response signals were already coming in from human ships and stations, acknowledgments that the message had been received and understood. Help was coming. Nova landed on his shoulder and nuzzled his cheek with a soft rumble of contentment. Spark settled on his other shoulder and began grooming his scales, completely unconcerned about the alien threat outside. Marcus looked around his ruined shelter, at the damaged equipment and the debris scattered everywhere, and found himself smiling. They'd won the first round, and that was enough for now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were all together, all safe, and all ready for whatever the universe decided to throw at them next. The rumble of approaching engines woke Marcus from his uneasy sleep. He'd managed to repair the worst damage to his shelter during the night, working by portable lighting while Nova and Spark took turns keeping watch. The dragons had grown again overnight, now each about the size of a small dog, and their intelligence seemed to be developing just as rapidly as their bodies. Marcus moved to the patched observation window and felt his heart sink. Commander Zethkar had returned with reinforcements. Instead of 3 ships, a full dozen alien craft now surrounded his shelter, their sleek hulls gleaming in the dawn light. This wasn't just a retrieval mission anymore. It was an overwhelming force meant to crush any possibility of resistance. "Well," Marcus said to the dragons, who had both taken position beside him at the window, "looks like they decided not to underestimate us this time." Nova chirped something that sounded distinctly sarcastic, while Spark was studying the alien formation with the intensity of a military strategist. Over the past few days, Marcus had begun to suspect that the dragons understood far more than they could yet express. The communication system crackled to life with Commander Zethkar's now familiar voice. "Human Marcus Chen, you have caused considerable inconvenience to our operation. This time there will be no opportunity for escape or resistance. Surrender the specimens immediately." Marcus was about to respond when Spark suddenly took flight, hovering near the communication console with obvious excitement. The small dragon began chirping rapidly in a pattern Marcus had never heard before, almost like he was trying to speak into the microphone. "Spark, what are you—" The dragon's chirps suddenly shifted, becoming more complex and rhythmic. And then, to Marcus's complete amazement, Spark began to speak. Not in English, but in the clicking melodic language of the Veltar. The communication channel went absolutely silent for a long moment before Commander Zethkar's voice returned, now filled with what sounded like shock. "That is impossible. The specimens cannot speak our language. They are mindless creatures bred only for war." Spark continued his rapid speech in the alien tongue, and Marcus could hear the increasing agitation in the commander's responses. Nova joined her brother, adding her own voice to what was clearly becoming an argument. "What are they saying?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he might not like the answer. The communication system translated the conversation automatically, and Marcus listened with growing amazement as the dragons systematically dismantled everything the Veltar believed about their own breeding program. Spark's voice, translated into English. "We are not mindless weapons, Commander. We remember everything. The pain of the genetic modifications, the forced conditioning, the other hatchlings who didn't survive your experiments." Nova added, "You call empathy and compassion defects, but they are what make us strong. We choose to protect those who cannot protect themselves. We choose to think beyond your programming." Commander Zethkar's response was sharp. "Impossible. You are young specimens. You cannot have retained memory of the breeding facilities." "We remember because we choose to remember," Spark said with a dignity that took Marcus's breath away. "And we remember the others who were discarded like us, the ones who didn't have a human to save them." The channel went quiet again, and Marcus realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. These dragons weren't just intelligent. They were actively rejecting everything the aliens had tried to make them into. That was when the scanners detected new ships approaching fast. But these weren't Veltar vessels. Marcus's emergency broadcast had reached the human fleet patrol vessel Rising Dawn, and Captain Sarah Martinez had apparently decided that a lone human protecting innocent creatures from alien military forces was exactly the kind of situation that demanded immediate intervention. The Rising Dawn dropped out of hyperspace like an avenging angel, followed by 2 escort destroyers and a support cruiser. The human ships took up positions around the planet with the kind of precision that spoke of a well-trained military force ready for action. Captain Martinez's voice came through the communication system with the crisp authority of a career military officer. "This is Captain Martinez of the human fleet vessel Rising Dawn. Commander Zethkar, your activities in this system are in violation of the Galactic Protection Accords. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." Commander Zethkar's response was predictably arrogant. "This is an internal Veltar operation, human. Your interference is not welcome. The specimens belong to us." "The specimens," Captain Martinez replied with ice in her voice, "are living beings under the protection of a human citizen. And attacking a human mining operation to steal children, yes, Commander, we received the full broadcast, is an act of war." Marcus felt a surge of pride at the captain's words. The human fleet wasn't just here to rescue him, they were here to protect Nova and Spark. But the Veltar weren't ready to back down. Commander Zethkar gave orders in his own language, and the alien ships began moving into attack formation. That was when the dragons surprised everyone, including Marcus. Nova and Spark took flight together, but instead of seeking shelter, they flew directly to the communication console. Working together with a coordination that spoke of shared intelligence, they began broadcasting on all frequencies. But they weren't speaking in Veltar or English. They were using a completely different language, one that sounded ancient and musical, and somehow familiar, despite being utterly alien. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every ship in the system, human and Veltar alike, received the transmission. But more importantly, something else received it too. The planet itself began to respond. The snow-covered landscape around Marcus's shelter started to tremble, and he realized that what he'd thought was solid ground was actually something much more extraordinary. The trembling intensified, and then the impossible happened. Dragons began emerging from the ice, not small dragons like Nova and Spark, but enormous adult creatures with scales that shifted from green to gold to silver in the morning light. They rose from hidden caves and concealed valleys, from beneath the snow and ice that had hidden them for who knew how long. Marcus stared in wonder as dozens, then hundreds of adult dragons took to the skies around his shelter. They moved with the grace of creatures born to fly, and their calls created a symphony that seemed to resonate in his very bones. "By the void!" Commander Zethkar's voice came through the communicator, filled with shock. "This planet is a breeding preserve, a wild dragon colony. That's impossible. Our surveys showed no intelligent life." Captain Martinez's voice was equally amazed. "Commander Chen, are you seeing this? There are hundreds of them." Marcus watched as Nova and Spark flew out to meet the adult dragons, and he saw the moment when the wild dragons recognized the 2 small ones as their own kind. The reunion was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, as adult dragons gently nuzzled the babies who had been stolen from their world. But the wild dragons weren't just celebrating a reunion. They were preparing for war. The largest dragon, a magnificent creature with scales that seemed to contain captured starlight, landed near the Veltar ships. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of ages and the fury of a parent whose children had been stolen and tortured. "Veltar," the dragon said, its words translated by the communication system, "you have taken our young for generations. You have twisted their minds and broken their spirits to serve your wars. This ends now. Commander Zethkar tried to maintain his authority. Ancient One, your offspring are our property. We have invested considerable resources in their development. The great dragon's laugh was like distant thunder. Property? You understand nothing. We allowed you to take some of our young because we believed you would care for them, help them grow strong. Instead, you tried to make them into weapons without souls. Marcus watched as more dragons landed around the alien ships. The Veltar were completely surrounded, their technological superiority meaningless against creatures who could fly, breathe fire, and possessed intelligence that had been refined over millennia. You will release all of our young that you have taken, the great dragon continued. You will cease your breeding programs, and you will leave our space forever. The standoff lasted for several tense minutes. The Veltar ships had powerful weapons, but they were outnumbered by creatures who could move in 3 dimensions and whose natural abilities were just as devastating as any technology. Commander Zethkar finally spoke, his voice defeated. The specimens, the young ones are already contaminated by human influence. They are useless to our purposes. They were never yours to begin with, Marcus said, surprising himself by entering the conversation. Nova and Spark aren't specimens or weapons. They're individuals with their own thoughts and feelings and choices to make. As if to prove his point, the 2 small dragons flew back to him, landing one on each shoulder just as they had that first night. But now they were different. Not just rescued babies, but young dragons who had found their place in the universe. Nova nuzzled his cheek and spoke in clear English. Thank you, Marcus. You saved us when we needed saving. Now we choose to stay with you because you are our friend. Spark added his own voice. You showed us that being different isn't being defective, that caring for others makes us stronger, not weaker. The great dragon turned its ancient gaze on Marcus, and he felt the weight of intelligence far older and deeper than his own. Human, the dragon said. You have done something remarkable. You saved 2 of our young not because you expected reward or recognition, but because it was right. This is a rare thing in the galaxy. Marcus felt heat in his cheeks but managed to respond. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, the great dragon said with certainty. Most would not. Most would have calculated the risks and chosen safety over compassion. This is why your species will go far among the stars. Captain Martinez's voice came through the communicator again. Commander Zethkar, what's it going to be? Withdraw peacefully, or face the combined forces of the human fleet and the dragon colony? The Veltar commander's defeat was complete and final. We withdraw. The specimens, the young dragons, are yours to deal with. As the alien ships lifted off and disappeared into hyperspace, Marcus found himself surrounded by dragons both large and small, human military officers who had come down from their ships, and a future that suddenly seemed full of incredible possibilities. Captain Martinez turned out to be a woman in her 50s with laugh lines around her eyes and the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Mr. Chen, she said, that was some of the finest human behavior I've seen in my 30 years of service. Standing up for those who can't defend themselves, refusing to back down in the face of overwhelming odds. That's what we're supposed to be about. Nova and Spark had grown again during the confrontation, now large enough to fly strongly and speak clearly. But they showed no desire to leave Marcus's side, and the great dragon had given them permission to choose their own path. We want to explore the galaxy, Nova told the assembled crowd. We want to see the human worlds and learn about the species that produces people like Marcus. Spark added, and we want to help other dragons who were taken by the Veltar. We know where their facilities are. We remember everything. Captain Martinez smiled. Well, Mr. Chen, it sounds like you're about to become the galaxy's first official dragon liaison. The fleet could use someone with your particular talents, especially if you're willing to help us shut down the rest of the Veltar breeding operations. Marcus looked around at the dragons, both young and ancient, at the human officers who had traveled across the void to help him protect two small lives, and at the vast possibilities that stretched out before them all. "I think I'd like that," he said. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the bridge of the Rising Dawn as it approached another Veltar facility. Nova and Spark flew beside the ship, now full-sized dragons with scales that gleamed like emeralds and hearts that still held all the compassion and empathy the aliens had tried so hard to breed out of them. They'd liberated 43 young dragons from various Veltar facilities, each one given the choice to return to their homeworld or explore the galaxy with the human fleet. Most chose to return home, but a few, like Nova and Spark, decided that the universe was too interesting to see from just one world. The Veltar had tried to create emotionless weapons of war. Instead, they'd created a new generation of dragons who understood the value of mercy, friendship, and standing up for those who needed protection. And at the center of it all was a simple truth that Marcus had discovered in a blizzard on a frozen world. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the universe isn't technology or weapons or superior force. Sometimes it's just one person who refuses to walk away when someone needs help. As the Rising Dawn approached its target, Marcus smiled and reached up to pat Nova's neck as she flew alongside the bridge viewports. In the distance, Spark was already scouting ahead, reporting back in the efficient military communication style he'd developed for their missions. They had work to do, dragons to rescue, and a galaxy to make safer for everyone who believed that compassion wasn't a weakness, but the greatest strength of all.